I still remember the night everything started to unravel, though at the time I didn't realize just how much it would change me. It was late autumn in 2018. One of those cold evenings in Boston where the air smells faintly of wood smoke and the streets glisten with the leftover drizzle of a stubborn rain. I had just come home from work, my hands numb from carrying grocery bags up the narrow staircase of our old apartment. I thought my life, while not perfect, was steady, comfortable even. I had a girlfriend of almost 4 years, Sarah, and a job that paid the bills, if not much more. I thought I was building something that would last. Looking back now, I see all the cracks that had been there long before I noticed them, the subtle shifts in her tone when I asked about her day. The way she angled her phone away from me when a message popped up. The late nights she chalked up to work deadlines. At the time, though, I brushed it off. Maybe it was denial. Maybe it was hope. Or maybe it was just easier to convince myself that everything was fine than to face the possibility that it wasn't. I was 28 then, still young enough to believe that love once found was unshakable. We had met in 2014, back when the world felt like it was holding its breath after the end of AIDS and turbulence of the early 2010s. Obama was still president. Happy by Pharrell was playing on every damn radio station. And Tinder was just beginning to change the way people dated. Sarah and I didn't meet online, though. We met the old-fashioned way through mutual friends at a bar in Cambridge. I wasn't even planning on going out that night. I had been exhausted from work, but one of my buddies dragged me out, promising me a good time. He was right. Sarah had this energy about her, this spark that drew people in. She laughed easily, not in that forced way people sometimes do at bars, but genuinely, like she found the world secretly hilarious. Her hair was this dark auburn that caught the dim light, and she carried herself with a kind of confidence that made me feel like she had everything figured out. I was hooked from the first conversation. We ended up talking until the bar closed, sitting in a booth long after her friends had left. By the time we said goodbye, I knew I wanted to see her again. The years that followed weren't always smooth, but they were ours. We moved in together after a year, splitting rent on that cramped Boston apartment that never quite lost its draft, no matter how many rugs we laid down. We went on trips when we could afford them, New York City in 2016. A week in Lisbon in 2017, when budget airlines were running insane deals. She loved to travel, and I loved seeing the world through her eyes. But by late 2018, things felt different. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. Maybe it was me. My job at the advertising firm had been draining me. The endless cycle of pitching to clients who wanted something edgy, but always settled for the safest idea, had begun to wear me down. I'd come home exhausted, my brain still humming with unfinished campaigns. Sarah, meanwhile, had just been promoted at her marketing job. She was excited, thriving even, and I told myself that maybe I just wasn't matching her energy. That had to be it, right? I tried to shake the unease. I cooked dinner more often, even though I was no Gordon Ramsay. I suggested weekend plans, farmers markets, new coffee shops, hikes outside the city. Sometimes she came along enthusiastically. Other times, she said she was too tired, or that she had plans with coworkers. I didn't question it much. Everyone deserves their own space. But little moments stuck with me. Like one night in November, when we were curled up on the couch watching Stranger Things, her phone buzzed and she tilted the screen away just slightly as she swiped the notification. I caught the edge of a smile she tried to hide. When I asked who it was, she said it was her friend Jenna, from work. Something about plans for the weekend. I believed her, but a part of me tucked that moment away like a pebble in my shoe small. But impossible to ignore once it's there. Christmas that year was quiet. We spent it with my family in Maine, snow piled high against the porch. The smell of my mom's roast chicken filling the house. Sarah seemed distracted, scrolling on her phone more often than usual. My sister made a joke about people not being able to survive without Instagram for more than 5 minutes. And Sarah laughed, but it felt strained. That night, when we went to bed in my old childhood room with the creaky twin bed, she stayed up texting long after I closed my eyes. Still, I told myself not to overthink. Everyone texts. Everyone has private conversations. I trusted her. Or maybe I needed to trust her because the alternative terrified me. By early 2019, though things had started to shift more noticeably. She began staying late at work more often, always with the excuse of a big campaign or last-minute client changes. She came home smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't her subtle, but noticeable. When I mentioned it once, half joking, she brushed it off and said she had sprayed something at the office from one of her coworkers. I laughed along, but in the pit of my stomach, doubt had started to take root. I wish I could say I confronted her then, that I demanded answers. But the truth is, I was scared. Scared of being wrong, of looking paranoid, scared of being right and losing the life we'd built. So I kept quiet, burying my suspicions under the weight of routine. There's one night that still plays in my head, though almost like a warning I ignored. It was late February, bitter cold, the kind of night where the Charles River looked like black glass under the streetlights. Sarah had said she was working late again. I decided to surprise her something simple, like picking her up with hot chocolate and walking her home. I drove to her office, parked nearby, and waited. After 20 minutes, I saw her leave. But she wasn't alone. She was walking with a man, tall, with broad shoulders and a navy peacoat. They laughed as they walked, their heads tilted toward each other in a way that looked more intimate than professional. I froze. For a few seconds, I considered getting out of the car, calling her name. But I didn't. Instead, I sat there, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, my breath fogging the glass. I told myself I was overreacting, that maybe it was just a coworker, a friend, nothing more. They didn't kiss, they didn't hold hands, at least not in those few minutes I watched. Eventually, I started the car and drove away, my chest tight. That night, when she came home, she kissed me on the cheek like nothing had happened. I kissed her back, my mind buzzing with unanswered questions. And that's how it went for months. Suspicion, denial, small moments of doubt smoothed over by routine. It wasn't until later, much later, that I realized I had been standing at the edge of a cliff the whole time. Blind to how close I was to falling, looking back it feels almost cinematic. Like the kind of slow-burn tragedy you only appreciate in hindsight. The red flags were all there, flapping wildly in the wind, but I convinced myself they were just shadows, tricks of the light. Because when you love someone, truly love them, you don't want to believe they're capable of betrayal, but love doesn't stop reality. And reality was waiting, sharp and merciless. Just around the corner, I can still feel the weight of that period of my life, the quiet dinners. The awkward silences, the excuses that stacked up like fragile cards. I can still see myself sitting at our wobbly kitchen table, trying to plan vacations or talk about the future, while Sarah scrolled through her phone with a half-smile she never explained. It was like living with a ghost present, but already halfway gone. If I could go back, maybe I'd confront her sooner. Maybe I'd save myself months of heartache. But I didn't. Instead, I let the unease grow, until it became something I couldn't ignore. Until the truth finally came crashing down in a way that shattered everything I thought I knew. And when it did, I wasn't the same person anymore. The breaking point came in the spring of 2019, though the truth is it had been building long before then. It was early April, one of those rare Boston days when the air finally begins to soften after months of biting cold. The snow had melted into dirty piles along the sidewalks. People were daring to wear lighter jackets, their faces lifted toward the sun as if they'd been starved of light all winter. I remember that day vividly, not because of the weather, but because it was the day everything I'd been trying to ignore finally spilled into the open. Sarah had been acting stranger than usual in the weeks leading up to it. More guarded, more easily irritated. She snapped at small things that never used to bother her. The way I loaded the dishwasher, the shows I chose to watch. Sometimes she'd retreat into the bedroom with her phone, closing the door under the guise of taking a call. I'd sit in the living room pretending to watch TV, my ears straining to catch her muffled voice. I couldn't make out words, but I could hear the cadence, soft and intimate in a way that made my stomach twist. I told myself it was stress, that maybe her new role at work was weighing on her. I told myself she needed space. I told myself 100 different stories, to avoid the one that had been staring me in the face for months. But denial can only carry you so far. The night it happened, I had been working late on a campaign presentation. My boss had been breathing down my neck for weeks about this one client. Tech startup that wanted to look fresh and disruptive, but was terrified of anything outside the mainstream. I stayed at the office until nearly 9 p.m., bleary-eyed and wired from too much bad coffee. When I finally shut down my computer, all I wanted was to crawl into bed. I called Sarah on my way home, just out of habit. No answer. I tried again, thinking she might still be at the office. No answer. By the time I pulled into our neighborhood, the unease had crept back in. Our apartment windows glowed warmly in the night, a sign she was home. My chest tightened as I climbed the stairs, my keys rattling in my hand. The door was locked, which was normal. But when I stepped inside, the air felt different. Warmer, heavier, filled with a faint scent I couldn't place. Not her perfume, not mine. Something muskier, unmistakably masculine. My pulse quickened. I set my bag down quietly, straining my ears. The apartment wasn't big, just a living room, kitchen, one bedroom, and a tiny bathroom. I heard it then, muffled laughter, hers, and another voice deeper. Male. I froze, my body buzzing with adrenaline, my brain refusing to accept what my ears were telling me. For a few seconds I considered walking back out, pretending I had never come home. But something inside me snapped. Maybe it was all the months of doubt, all the little red flags I had smoothed over. Maybe I just couldn't take another second of not knowing. I walked toward the bedroom, my footsteps heavy on the hardwood floor. The laughter stopped. The door was half closed, and when I pushed it open, the world shifted. There they were. Sarah, tangled in the sheets with the man I had seen outside her office weeks earlier. His shirt was on the floor, her hair a mess around her flushed face. For a moment, no one moved. It was like a still frame, time suspended. My stomach dropped, the air rushing out of me as if I'd been punched. Sarah's eyes went wide, her mouth opening like she was about to say something, but no words came out. The man, broad-shouldered, smug even in his shock, sat up slowly, his expression unreadable. I don't remember exactly what I said. My voice cracked, my words tumbling out like shards of glass. Something about betrayal, about how long it had been going on. She stammered excuses, her hands reaching out as if to calm me, but I couldn't hear her. My ears rang, my vision tunneled. All I could see was the image burned into my brain, her with him. The bed we shared tainted with their laughter. I turned and left. My body moved on autopilot, down the stairs, out the door, into the cold spring night. My chest heaved as I walked aimlessly, my breath clouding in the air. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't be there. I ended up at a bar a few blocks away. One of those dimly lit dives with sticky floors and neon beer signs buzzing faintly. I sat at the counter, ordered a whiskey neat, and stared at the glass as if it held answers. My hands shook as I lifted it, the burn in my throat doing nothing to dull the ache in my chest. I thought about the years we'd spent together, the trips, the late-night talks, the plans for the future. All of it crumbled in an instant, reduced to ashes by the sight of her with someone else. I replayed every red flag I had ignored, every moment I had told myself not to worry. Each one felt like a knife twist. At some point my phone buzzed. Messages from Sarah. Apologies, pleased to talk. Promises that it wasn't what it looked like, which was laughable because it was exactly what it looked like. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My throat was tight, my chest hollow. The next day I didn't go home. I crashed at my friend Eric's place, tossing and turning on his lumpy couch. He asked what happened, and when I told him, his face hardened with anger. He said all the things I couldn't say out loud yet, that she didn't deserve me, that I should cut her off, that I was better than this. His words helped, but only in the way a bandage helps a wound that's still bleeding. When I finally went back to the apartment a couple of days later, Sarah was there waiting. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her hair pulled back messily. She tried to hug me, but I stepped back. The sight of her made my stomach churn. She launched into a speech, how it was a mistake, how she hadn't meant for it to happen, how she still loved me. I stood there, listening, my arms crossed. Part of me wanted to scream, to throw things, to demand every detail. Another part of me felt eerily calm, like I was floating above my own body. I told her I needed space, and I meant it. I couldn't process it all at once. I packed a bag and left, moving into Eric's spare room for the time being. She kept texting, calling, begging me to talk. Some messages were apologetic, others defensive, as if she wanted me to shoulder some of the blame. Each one chipped away at whatever was left of the love I had felt for her. The weeks that followed were a blur of anger, sadness, and numbness. I'd go to work during the day, pretending everything was fine, then collapse at night, playing the betrayal in my head like a film stuck on repeat. My appetite vanished. Music I once loved now felt unbearable, every lyric a reminder of what I had lost. I avoided mutual friends because I couldn't bear their pity or their curiosity. What hurt most wasn't just the cheating itself. It was the realization that she had been living a double life, right under my nose. The laughter, the late nights, the perfume, it all made sense now, and the weight of my own denial crushed me. I felt like a fool, like I had been walking around with a blindfold while everyone else saw the truth. But in that darkness, something began to stir. Anger, yes, but also resolve. I didn't want to be the guy who was broken forever by someone else's betrayal. I wanted her to feel what I had felt, to know the devastation of being blindsided. The hollow ache of losing everything you thought was solid. I didn't know it then. But the seeds of revenge were already being planted. It wasn't about pettiness, at least not entirely. It was about reclaiming control. She thought I didn't know. Thought she could juggle me and him indefinitely. Thought I would never catch on. But I did. And I wasn't about to let her walk away, thinking she had gotten away with it. No, I was going to make sure she understood the cost of what she had done. I was going to plan it carefully, methodically, till the moment was perfect. And when it came, she would be completely speechless. After the door closed on that night in April, the world didn't stop turning. People went to work. Buses still rumbled down Massachusetts Avenue. And the city continued its indifferent rhythms. But for me, everything had tilted on its axis. The fallout wasn't a single wave. It was a series of small tsunamis that hit me in slow succession, each one pulling away a little more of who I'd been. The first thing I lost was routine. I used to take comfort in the small daily patterns, making coffee in the same chipped mug, riding the same route on my bike through the public garden, reading the sports page on Sundays with a half-listening ear. Those things became traps, reminders of how domestic my life had been. I couldn't sit in our living room without seeing the mark on the couch where we used to share blankets. I couldn't touch the plates in the cabinet without thinking of the dinners she'd canceled. The apartment felt like a museum of the past, and I was walking through it like an intruder. Work became another battlefield. I managed to keep showing up, but the sparkle I used to bring to campaigns was dull. Creative meetings used to be the part of my job where I felt alive, the energy in a room when people riffed off each other. The thrill of a good idea landing with the client. After the betrayal, those rooms felt clinical, like operating theaters where I had to perform but couldn't remember the script. My boss noticed. She asked once, in that soft corporate way people use to avoid saying the words, "You look tired," whether everything was okay. I told her I was fine. I lied so well that she accepted it. But the numbers didn't lie. I missed deadlines, my pitches lost their edge. A high-profile client subtly stopped inviting me to the brainstorm sessions that used to be my territory. Sleep deserted me. Nights were a tangle of images: the bed, the man's profile, Sarah's laugh like a recording stuck on repeat. I would wake up at 3 a.m. with my heart pounding, convinced I'd missed a call from her, only to stare at the ceiling and feel the room close in. I started sleeping on Eric's couch more often because I couldn't bear the silence of my own apartment. There's a peculiar cruelty to waking up in a friend's spare room, no photographs on the nightstand. No memories lodged in the wallpaper, just blankness and the faint scent of whatever detergent his roommate used. It should have felt cleaner, but it felt sterile and temporary, exactly like the life I'd been thrown into. Family ran toward me. My mother called every other day at first, voice trembling with that maternal mixture of fury and worry. She said things she probably regretted, later advice wrapped in anger, salt in my wound, disguised as tough love. My father, quieter, sent me a text that simply said, "We're here. Come home." Went to Maine for a weekend in May. the house where I grew up smelling of pine and old books. Being back with them was both balm and mirror. They wanted to shelter me, but their concern constantly reminded me of how I'd failed to see what was happening. My sister, who had always been the blunt one, said at dinner that I deserved better. It was the only thing she said that landed cleanly inside me. Friends split into camps in ways that surprised me. Some rallied around me with the kind of performative anger you see on late-night shows, ready to meme her infidelity into oblivion, to parade me as the wounded hero in their group chats. Others, awkward and unsure, drifted away because they didn't know what to say. The worst were the ones who tried to be neutral, as if betrayal were a fashionable debate to be moderated. It wasn't. It was a slow grind into isolation. I found myself declining invitations, not because I didn't want company, but because I couldn't bear the small talk. Small talk felt like salt on an open wound. Then there was social media, that digital funhouse mirror. I thought I could avoid it, but it taxed me in a way I hadn't expected. I would scroll and see her photos of lunches with coworkers, selfies with captions about killing it at work. I watched as she curated a life that refused to acknowledge the wreckage she had caused. There was one photo in particular that stung, a shot of her at a rooftop bar in June, the skyline hazy behind her, a drink in hand. The same man in the background just out of focus. She was laughing in the way I remembered from that first night we met. And for an instant, I felt like I was watching the same person I had loved walk off into somebody else's movie. I tried to block her, to avoid the dopamine of updates, but curiosity kept pulling me back. It was a cruel, addictive verification that she had moved on in ways I hadn't. I considered legal action, absurdly and briefly. The idea of custody didn't apply, we didn't have children, but there was a temptation to make things official, to create paperwork that would validate my pain. I spoke to a lawyer in a consultation that lasted 15 minutes, just to see what my options were. There was no recourse for what had happened. Cheating wasn't illegal. It was morally condemnable, but the law had no interest. That only deepened the feeling of helplessness. If the system couldn't help me, then what could I do? I took to sleuthing, which felt both pathetic and empowering at once. I combed through messages, piecing together timelines from the fragments she'd left behind, screenshots of plans, innocent-seeming emails, little indicators that, when arranged properly, formed a mosaic of deception. I drove past her office one evening, watching from across the street the neon of a diner washing the pavement in color. The man I'd seen before was there sometimes, sometimes not. Once I saw them leave together, their movement casual, as if the world hadn't been appended. Each observation was a small, cold victory. I told myself I was only gathering facts, but it was darker than that. There was a part of me that wanted to hurt her in return, to make her feel the rupture she'd caused me to feel. Friends noticed the change in me and tried to intervene. Eric insisted I talk to someone not in a dismissive get-over-it way, but genuinely he said it like he meant it, like I was bleeding and needed stitches. I started seeing a therapist in July, a woman whose office smelled faintly of eucalyptus, and who had the kind of patience that makes you feel both exposed and honored. I liked her in a way that surprised me. Talking about my pain out loud made it less like a live wire and more like a story I could examine. She helped me name things I'd been avoiding: abandonment fears, attachment patterns, the weird compulsion to fix things that were broken by other people. There was no magic cure, of course. But the sessions gave me tools, breathing exercises for panic, ways to recognize when I was spiraling, assignments to try small acts of self-kindness. It was humiliating and cathartic all at once. Work mattered more than I expected in my recovery. Losing my edge at the agency scared me. My identity had always been tethered to my ability to make things people liked. I forced myself back into the grind, using the deadlines as anchors. There were still days when I couldn't string together a coherent sentence, but there were also small wins. A campaign I'd shepherded got good feedback. A junior colleague thanked me for a suggestion that helped her presentation. Those little moments of competence were stitches in a garment I was trying to mend, but amid the slow rebuilding, the betrayal continued to echo in unexpected ways. There were dreams where I would confront her in public, where her face dissolved into a crowd and then into someone I'd never met. There were days when I'd walk past couples on the sidewalk and feel a hot, irrational envy that made my palms sweat. I developed a brittle armor, funny sarcastic, a little cruel at times. It was a defense mechanism that kept people at arm's length. Dating felt impossible. The thought of letting someone into that space where trust lived frightened me. Financially, the split was awkward. We had shared bills, subscriptions, and a joint savings account that in the middle of the breakup became a negotiation I was too raw to handle well. Splitting assets was less dramatic than I'd imagined, practical, oddly grown-up. There was no dramatic courtroom battle, just a bank transfer and a list of who got what. That practical sorting felt like another measure of loss, as if even the mundane details of cohabitation had to be dismantled and assigned. Then, in the quiet moments, the memory of small kindnesses haunted me. Her hand on my shoulder the night my grandmother died, the way she had once pressed a hand to my back when I cried about a failed promotion, the way she hummed off-key while making coffee. Those memories were not erased by betrayal. They made the hurt worse because they were true proof that she had the capacity for tenderness, even as she chose to be cruel. It made me question the narratives I was telling myself. Was she always bad? Was I naive? Or did people simply have the capacity to be both loving and monstrous at different times? I cycled through anger and pity, revenge fantasies, and quiet moments of longing. I would wake up furious, and then, halfway through the day, feel a wave of sadness so heavy it anchored me to the spot. Grief, I learned, wasn't linear. It was a weather system. Gusts of rage, sudden downpours of regret, long stretches of dull gray. Friends tried to keep my spirits up with jokes, weekend outings, the kind of forced optimism that works for a while until the real work is done. By late summer of 2019, I had settled into a rhythm that was somewhere between cautious healing and meticulous planning. I wasn't the same person who had walked into that apartment in April and seen her with him. That man, whoever he was, had been a shadow that haunted me for months. But now he was a piece of evidence, a footnote, in a larger story I was preparing to reclaim. The ember-eyed nurse during those sleepless nights had become something sharper, colder, more precise. It was no longer just anger. It was strategy. I started small, testing the waters, feeling out her routines, her vulnerabilities. I still had mutual friends who didn't know the full extent of what had happened, and I leaned on them in subtle ways. Not to gossip, though that temptation occasionally surged, but to gather information indirectly. People let things slip when they think you're not paying attention. I listened more than I spoke, making mental notes that I cataloged in my head like a private dossier. Social media, which had once been a source of anguish, became a tool. I didn't post anything about her. That was too obvious, too emotional. Instead, I observed patterns. The times she left work, the nights she was busy with friends, the subtle mentions of him in posts that tried to appear casual. Every post, every story, was a breadcrumb leading to a larger picture. There's something methodical about watching someone this way, something that sharpens your mind even as it tugs at your conscience. I also had to reclaim myself in the real world. I joined a boxing gym in South Boston. It's a kind of place with cracked mirrors and the faint smell of sweat and old leather gloves. At first, it was purely therapeutic. I needed the physical release, the satisfaction of hitting a bag as hard as my thoughts were beating me up. But over time, it became part of the plan. Boxing made me disciplined, taught me patience, focus, and the value of timing. I realized that revenge, like a fight, required preparation, awareness, and a steady hand. Acting too early, too emotionally, would ruin everything. Meanwhile, Sarah continued her life. Oblivious, or maybe arrogantly confident that I hadn't caught on. By August, she had become audacious. I knew about trips she had taken with him, dinner reservations she had made at restaurants I had once hoped we'd go to together, and parties where she flaunted her freedom in ways that would have broken me entirely if I hadn't trained my mind to observe rather than react. The fire inside me burned, but now it was tempered. I was no longer the shocked, heartbroken fool. I was the architect of what came next. Then came the opportunity. It was almost cinematic in its precision, though of course it wasn't planned that way from the start. One Thursday evening, I noticed on social media that she and him were attending a private gala at a well-known Boston hotel. Tickets were exclusive, invitations by word of mouth, and I knew her ego would compel her to post about it heaven subtly. I began preparing. I researched the venue, the guest list, the layout of the rooms, even the valet entrances. I wanted everything to be perfect, to ensure the next act was executed with precision. I didn't tell anyone about my plans. Not Eric, not my therapist, not friends. This had to be mine alone, a reclamation of power that couldn't be diluted by advice or sympathy. I acquired access to the hotel lobby through legitimate means, booking a conference room. Under a pretense, timed my arrival carefully. The goal wasn't violence. It wasn't even confrontation. It was something more subtle or profound. The moment where she would realize that the web she had spun so delicately was about to unravel publicly, and that the spectator was someone she had underestimated on the night itself. I dressed sharply, the way I used to before a client presentation, but with a purpose beyond appearance. I arrived early, blending into the crowd as guests filtered in, champagne flutes in hand, heels clicking against the marble floors. I positioned myself strategically, out of sight, but with a clear vantage point to see her when she arrived. She came in, radiant and confident, draped in a gown I recognized from Instagram posts months earlier. Her laughter carried easily, the same laugh that had once made me feel invincible. But tonight, it didn't belong to her. Tonight, it was the laughter of someone who had no idea they were about to be undone. I watched them navigate the crowd, smiling at familiar faces, entirely unaware of the observer cataloging every gesture, every interaction. I knew the precise moment to act because of months of observation. There was a charity auction planned to highlight of the evening. I had arranged under the guise of an anonymous donation for an item to appear with a personal inscription. Nothing illegal, nothing physically damaging. Just the truth, unflinching in public. When the auctioneer revealed the item, there it was, a detailed account of her infidelity. Dates, places, and even small photographs I had captured discreetly. The description was clinical, almost detached, more like evidence than accusation. I wanted the message to be unmistakable, undeniable, and inescapable. The reaction was immediate. Her face went pale, her laughter vanishing as though someone had pulled the air from the room. Her eyes darted around, scanning faces, searching for me or anyone who could have known. I stayed seated, calm, watching the collapse with an almost surgical detachment. He, the man who had seemed so secure in his conquest, faltered, unsure of how to respond. The crowd murmured, a low wave of confusion and curiosity spreading through the room. I had orchestrated it so that no one could accuse me of confrontation or harassment. The truth, revealed in a public forum, was its own vindication. After the gala, I didn't chase her. I didn't need to. The message had been delivered. She reached out frantically, by text and email, but I didn't respond. I went home feeling a strange mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion. There was no gloating, no triumphant speech to friends. The victory was private, cerebral. She had underestimated me. She had assumed I was passive, naive, incapable of reclaiming my dignity, and I had proved her wrong without lifting my voice, without compromising my principles. In the weeks following, the fallout extended beyond just the two of us. Mutual friends began asking questions. Conversations shifted. Whispers circulated. She had to navigate a social world that suddenly viewed her differently. It wasn't revenge in the violent sense, but it was effective. People noticed the integrity in my restraint, the clarity in how I presented the facts without malice. I became, in a strange way, the quiet center of the storm she had created. During this time, I also focused on myself in ways that had nothing to do with her. I traveled for the first time since the Betrayal, a solo trip to Portland, Maine. I wandered the coast, watching the waves crash against the rocks, letting the wind carry away the remnants of grief that had lingered for months. I ate in small cafes, talked to strangers, rediscovered the simple joys of life without compromise. It was humbling and liberating. The act of planning and executing revenge had been cathartic. Yes, but it was the reclamation of myself that ultimately mattered. I started dating again, cautiously at first. Nothing serious, nothing forced. Just dinners and coffee and tentative connections that didn't carry the weight of past betrayals. I learned painfully to trust myself again, to listen to intuition, to value my own standards, to recognize the signs before history repeated itself. There were moments when I reflected on the moral tightrope I had walked. Revenge is a seductive idea, especially when one has been wounded deeply. But I had restrained myself from cruelty, from public shaming that crossed ethical boundaries. That restraint gave the act its power. I hadn't destroyed her life. I had exposed her choices in a controlled, precise way that allowed reality to speak for itself. I had reclaimed my agency, and that was far more valuable than any petty triumph. By the end of 2019, I felt a clarity I hadn't known for months. The betrayal no longer haunted me like a ghost in the bedroom. It had been transformed into a lesson in vigilance, in patience, in personal sovereignty. I had learned how much power I truly held when I chose to act deliberately rather than react impulsively. The sting of heartbreak was still there, of course. A scar that would fade, but never vanish entirely. But it was no longer a shackle. It was a reminder of my resilience, and somewhere deep in the background. In quiet moments when the city was asleep and the wind pressed against the windows, I realized something crucial. I had taken the pain and made it mine. It's not hers, not his. Mine. I had turned destruction into structure, heartbreak into clarity, and betrayal into a catalyst for transformation. It was messy, complicated, morally ambiguous, but it was mine. I had turned the tables, and I was no longer a victim. By the beginning of 2020, life had started to feel different, quieter, but not in a way that meant peace more, in a way that meant I had cleared the storm from around me and could finally see the sky again. The act of turning the tables had given me a strange sense of closure, though it was never neat or cinematic. Life rarely is. There were no victory parades. No dramatic confrontations afterward, just the slow, steady work of reclaiming myself from the wreckage she had left behind. The weeks and months that followed were a strange mixture of relief, emptiness, and clarity. She had largely disappeared from my life, though I heard about her from mutual friends from time to time. There were whispers, yes, but they were more like background noise than anything that could reach me. I had constructed boundaries so firm they were almost physical. Social media blocked, phone numbers deleted, mutual friends carefully managed. I realized that the power she had wielded before, the ability to dominate my thoughts, to make my life feel fragile, was gone. I didn't need to chase her for justice anymore. I had already claimed it in my own way. I started to focus on myself in a way I had never allowed before. Travel became a kind of therapy. I flew to cities I'd always wanted to: see London, Dublin, Edinburgh, walking their streets alone and letting the unfamiliar architecture, the buzz of foreign conversations, and the smell of rain-slicked cobblestones fill me with a sense of freedom I hadn't known I could feel. Every time I navigated a foreign city, I reminded myself how far I'd come from the man who had sat frozen on the couch in April, feeling the betrayal like a physical weight pressing into his chest. Each solo adventure, every quiet moment in a museum or a cafe, became part of my reclamation, work too transformed. I threw myself into projects with renewed energy, and not for anyone else's approval, just for myself. The campaigns I once doubted now carried a sharper edge, an authenticity born from having been burned but refusing to stay down. I got promoted that year, not because anyone felt sorry for me, but because I had reasserted myself, sharpened by pain and experience. There was a confidence that had been absent before, quiet but unmistakable, and it was exactly what I needed to carry forward. One of the most surprising developments was in my friendships. Eric and a few other close friends had stuck by me during the worst periods. And as I regained stability, our bonds deepened. We laughed more freely, we shared deeper stories, and there was a sense of camaraderie born out of mutual respect and survival. Betrayal had a way of clarifying who mattered, and I no longer wasted time or energy on people who were superficial or unreliable. It was refreshing, though sometimes lonely in its own way. Independence carries that cost. The emotional landscape, however, remained complicated. There were moments when her absence still echoed through the apartment, or when a familiar laugh in public would trigger a rush of memory and pain. But these moments were no longer debilitating. They were brushstrokes on a larger canvas I had been repainting. They reminded me of what I had endured, and what I had emerged from stronger and more self-aware. I began journaling those thoughts, not as therapy prescribed by someone else, but as a personal ritual, writing down the unvarnished truths of my emotions, reflecting on mistakes, growth, and the strange beauty of survival. Then, one evening in October, I ran into her unexpectedly at a bookstore in Cambridge. It was a cold night, the wind cutting through my coat as I browsed the aisles. She was there, looking different in a way I couldn't immediately place, perhaps a little older, a little wearier, carrying herself with a weight that hadn't been there before. Our eyes met briefly across the stacks, and for a moment, the years seemed to collapse. She tried to smile, a hesitant, unsure movement that seemed almost rehearsed. I didn't return it. Not out of malice, but out of recognition that our chapter had closed. No words were exchanged. I didn't need them. The look in her eyes, recognition, guilt, maybe even regret, was enough to confirm everything. I had built my closure in my own way, and I didn't require validation from her. The power had shifted. It always had. That encounter, brief as it was, solidified something I had been learning over months. Revenge and closure are not the same, though they intersect. The plan I had executed at the gala had been the apex of a particular phasenger, transformed into precision, but it was not the resolution. True resolution, I realized, came from reclaiming yourself, rebuilding your life, and refusing to let someone else's choices dictate your emotional trajectory. In the months that followed, I began dating seriously for the first time since the betrayal. I approached it cautiously, aware of my vulnerabilities, but also confident in my boundaries. I met someone who was kind, grounded, and emotionally available, qualities I had once taken for granted. We traveled together, cooked together, argued about minor things, and made up. All of it grounding me in the reality of a life that could still be loving even after deep betrayal. Love, I discovered, could be rebuilt and replicated, not resurrected, but reinvented in its own form. I also started mentoring younger colleagues at work, sharing lessons not just about advertising, but about life, about trust, boundaries, and resilience. It surprised me how much people gravitated toward someone who had endured and emerged on the other side. Their questions, their curiosity, their own struggles reminded me that my pain had not been in vain. It had given me perspective and wisdom I could now share. Looking back on the ordeal, I recognize how much it shaped me. Betrayal had forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about myself, about human nature, and about the fragility of relationships. It had also forced me to discover a depth of resilience I might never have known otherwise. In a strange way, I am grateful not for the betrayal itself, of course, but for the clarity, strength, and autonomy it compelled me to find. By the end of 2020, I had moved into a new apartment, a space entirely my own, filled with objects that spoke to my personality rather than shared history. I had a routine that I enjoyed, a social circle that was supportive without being intrusive, and a sense of self that no longer relied on validation from someone who had once deceived me. The last vestiges of pain lingered in quiet moments, as they always do. I would sometimes think of her, briefly, and a flash of anger or sadness might flicker across my mind. But it no longer held me hostage. The revenge, the public exposure, the reclaiming of my narrative, all of it had served its purpose. The rest was mine too, right? On New Year's Eve of 2020, standing on the rooftop of my apartment building with the city lights sprawled below, I thought of the journey, the betrayal, the heartbreak, the planning, the execution, and the ultimate reclaiming of self. The fireworks burst across the skyline, brilliant and fleeting, and I felt a strange sense of peace. I raised a glass of cheap sparkling wine and let the memory of that fateful April night settle into the past where it belonged. I had been shattered, yes, But from the fragments, I had built something stronger, clearer, more resilient. I had faced betrayal, confronted it, and emerged not just intact but transformed. And for the first time in months, I didn't feel like a man defined by someone else's choices. I felt like a man who had endured, adapted, reclaimed his life in the fullest sense possible. Life would never be simple, and scars don't fade completely. But they become part of the story, a testament to survival, to growth, and to the quiet, unassailable strength that emerges when you refuse to let someone else write your ending. In the end, she thought I didn't know, thought she could deceive me indefinitely. But I did know, and the most powerful revenge, I realized, wasn't the act itself. It was living fully, unapologetically, and stronger than I had ever been before. And that, I think, is the story she will never forget.